The gym was quiet except for the sharp squeak of a mop sliding across the polished floor. The night classes had run longer than usual, and most of the students were finishing their drills when the voice of a man cut through the air like a whip. "Hey, you there with the mop? Want to give us a little demonstration?" The challenge came from Ryan Carter, a proud black belt who enjoyed being the center of attention. He stood in the middle of the mat, his belt tied tight around his waist, and a smug grin spread across his face. His tone wasn't friendly. It carried the weight of mockery, meant to impress the 8 students watching. The man he addressed was Daniel Reed, a janitor who had been working at the Ironwood Martial Arts Academy for less than a month. At 43 years old, Daniel had a quiet presence. He kept to his duties, cleaned when no one was around, and rarely spoke more than a polite word to anyone. Tonight was different. Tonight the students hadn't gone home yet. Tonight Ryan wanted entertainment. "I bet you've never even seen a real fight in your life," Ryan said loudly so everyone in the room could hear. He spread his arms theatrically, grinning as the students chuckled nervously. Some looked away, uncomfortable, while others laughed just to stay on Ryan's good side. Daniel paused, pressing the mop against the floor. Slowly, he looked up. His eyes were calm, steady, almost detached. "I don't want to interrupt your training," he replied in a soft voice. "Just finishing my work here so you can continue." Ryan laughed hard, throwing his head back. "Did you hear that? He's too scared to even step on the mat." The room filled with uneasy laughter. A young woman in the corner bit her lip, clearly uneasy with the mockery. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone could feel that Ryan wasn't going to let it go. What no one in that gym knew was that Daniel carried 20 years of silence inside him, 20 years of hiding, 20 years of trying to forget who he really was. He had walked away from a life that once defined him, burying a past that even his teenage son had never heard about. Ryan took a step forward, that same arrogant smile plastered on his face. "Come on, man. Just a quick demonstration. Show them difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans up after us." Daniel felt a strange sensation ripple through him. It was like a dormant muscle stirring awake after decades of rest. His chest tightened, not with fear but with something older, deeper, something he thought he had left behind forever. Their eyes met for a brief second. Ryan flinched almost imperceptibly, as if he had glimpsed something dangerous behind Daniel's calm expression. Still he pressed on, unwilling to lose face. "Nothing serious," Ryan said, now trying to mask his unease. "Just to educate the beginners." Daniel placed the mop back in the bucket and stood up slowly. His movements carried a fluidity that seemed unnatural for a man who supposedly had never stepped onto a mat. Around the gym, chatter ceased. The air shifted. The students began to sense that this wasn't going to be a harmless demonstration. "All right," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady like the surface of a still lake. "But when this is over, you'll apologize to them. Every single one of them, for turning this mat into your stage." Ryan forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Apologize, you'll be the one apologizing to the floor after it kisses your face." No one laughed this time, because what none of them knew was that Daniel Reed had once been Daniel Ironstorm Reed, a 5-time world champion in mixed martial arts. He had retired at the peak of his career after an accident that shattered him in ways no opponent ever could. Since then, he had sworn never to fight again, but some promises are tested when dignity is on the line. Ryan Carter adjusted his belt with exaggerated flair, savoring the eyes fixed on him. He wanted this to be a spectacle, a reminder of his authority in the gym. His students formed a half circle around the mat, some curious, some uneasy. One of them, a young woman named Emily Chen, muttered to her classmate, "This doesn't feel right." Her companion only shook his head, unwilling to speak out. Ryan spread his arms like a showman. "Gather round, everyone. Tonight you'll witness why hierarchy matters. Some people train, others just clean. And there's a difference." His words dripped with arrogance, but Daniel Reed did not flinch. He simply rolled his shoulders, as if settling into an old familiar coat. His calmness unsettled Ryan more than any glare could have. Emily raised her hand timidly, Sensei, maybe we should continue normal training. It's getting late. Ryan's expression darkened. Emily Chen, he snapped, deliberately using her full name. Do you question my teaching methods? Her voice caught in her throat. No, Sensei. She sank back, eyes down, though Daniel noticed the fear behind them. That fear pulled Daniel back to memories he had locked away. 20 years ago, he had seen that same fear in his own reflection. The fear that had followed him after the night his closest friend, his sparring partner, Marcus Hale, had died because of him. Not through malice, not through intent, but through a single uncontrolled strike that ended a life. The official report called it an accident, but Daniel carried the truth like a chain around his neck. Rage, humiliation, and racial taunts from the crowd had broken his focus that night. He had let anger control him. Marcus had paid the price. Now standing on that mat under fluorescent lights, Daniel felt the weight of it all pressing against his chest. Ryan's smirk. The uneasy faces of the students. The sting of disrespect that echoed comments he had heard. His entire life, Ryan circled him like a predator. Come on, Janitor. Show them a basic guard. Or is that too complicated for someone who pushes a mop all day? Nervous laughter rippled through the students, but Daniel stood motionless. His eyes closed briefly. For a moment, he was no longer in Ironwood Academy. He was back in the Las Vegas Grand Arena, hearing the crowd jeer, hearing the same words that had set the tragedy in motion. What's wrong? Afraid? Ryan taunted, pushing him lightly on the shoulder. It was a small push, but it carried arrogance and cruelty. The room went silent. Daniel didn't budge. His feet were planted firm, like roots sunk into stone. Ryan's smile flickered, just for an instant. Interesting, Daniel murmured, almost to himself. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made every ear tune in. There was no anger in his tone, no boast, just the quiet strength of someone who had walked through storms far darker than this moment. Ryan, desperate to keep control of The room tried to laugh it off. Did you hear that? He thinks this is interesting. He turned to his students. Let's show him the difference between thinking and knowing. But Ryan had no idea. Every insult, every shove, every arrogant word wasn't weakening Daniel. It was awakening him. Not anger, not vengeance, something stronger. The crystal clear memory of who he had once been, when he stopped hiding. Emily watched intently. She noticed the way Daniel breathed, the way his muscles coiled, not in tension, but in readiness. She had studied predators in wildlife documentaries, and what she saw was no different, the calm that comes right before the strike. Ryan sneered. Last chance, Janitor. Accept the demonstration, or I call security. You lose your job. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. His gaze locked on Ryan's, and for the first time Ryan felt a chill run through him, as if the harmless janitor had just transformed into something else entirely. All right, Daniel said softly. His voice cut through the silence. But when this ends, you'll explain to them why you turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation. Ryan forced another laugh, though his voice cracked. We'll see who's humiliated. What Ryan didn't realize was that Daniel had spent 20 years mastering something far more dangerous than rage. He had turned destructive fury into discipline. He had transformed guilt into control. And now that control was about to be tested. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling lights. Ryan Carter squared his shoulders and raised his fists into his favorite stance, the one he used to intimidate every beginner who walked into Ironwood Academy, feet apart, fists tight, chin high. He looked confident, but there was something fragile in the way his eyes darted between Daniel and his students. Daniel didn't move. He simply stood in the center of the mat, relaxed, his breathing steady and measured. But beneath that calm, decades of muscle memory were waking up. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His weight lowered, his shoulders aligned, his stance balanced so perfectly that anyone with experience would recognize it as the mark of a seasoned fighter. Emily Chen's eyes widened. She had studied biomechanics as part of her graduate work. The way Daniel carried himself wasn't random. It was mastery. She whispered under her breath, "This isn't ordinary." Ryan smirked, trying to regain control. "Still standing there? Or are you just a lamppost holding a mop?" He laughed, expecting the room to join in, but no one did. The silence, pressed heavier by the second. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost kind. "You've made this into a performance, Ryan, but remember this. When it's over, the lesson won't be mine. It will be yours." Ryan flushed red. He couldn't afford to look weak, not in front of his students. "Enough talk," he barked, bouncing lightly on his feet. "Show me what you've got." Daniel lowered his gaze for a brief moment, and when he raised it again, his eyes carried the same intensity that had once silenced arenas filled with thousands. The same eyes that had stared down world champions under blinding lights. He hadn't been called Iron Storm for nothing. Ryan didn't recognize it, but his body did. Some ancient instinct screamed at him to step back. Without thinking, he shuffled one foot backward. Several students noticed. Their black belt, their instructor, had retreated. From a janitor, Ryan forced a grin to cover the slip. "Just admiring your posture," he said mockingly. "What did you do? Watch some YouTube tutorials?" Again, silence. No one laughed. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I learned it at the National Center in Phoenix. Maybe you've heard of it." Ryan frowned. The name tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. To him, it sounded like just another local facility. He shrugged it off. "Weekend boot camp?" he sneered. Emily wasn't so quick to dismiss it. She quietly pulled out her phone and typed the name into her search bar. What she found made her blood run cold. Phoenix National was legendary, a cradle for champions, a place where the greatest fighters of the last 3 decades had been forged. Meanwhile, Ryan grew impatient. "Enough of this. Either fight or get off my mat." Daniel's calm voice returned. "I'll give you one more chance. Apologize to her." He nodded toward Emily. "And to them for turning this into humiliation instead of teaching." Ryan's laugh was sharp and nervous. "Apologize? You'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." He lunged forward with a jab. It was fast, precise, the kind of punch that had landed countless times on beginners. But Daniel wasn't there. He had shifted to the side with the ease of water flowing around a stone. Ryan stumbled, his fist slicing through empty air. "Nice try," Daniel said softly, already balanced again. "Clean technique, decent speed, but you telegraph with your right shoulder every time." Gasps rippled through the students. Ryan spun around, flustered, his jaw tightened. Beginner's luck. He came again, jab, straight, hook, a polished combination he had drilled thousands of times. But again, Daniel wasn't there. He bent, leaned, and stepped away in movements so fluid they seemed to defy logic. Ryan's punches cut nothing but air. "Interesting sequence," Daniel remarked evenly. "It works well on people who stand still, but you leave your entire left side open." Ryan's breath grew ragged. Sweat formed at his temples. For the first time in his life, he realized he couldn't touch his opponent. "Stop dancing and fight," Ryan roared, unleashing a furious barrage, kicks, punches, wild flurries designed to overwhelm. And still, Daniel wasn't there. Every strike missed. Every kick met only the emptiness of the mat. But this time, something changed. When Ryan regained his footing after the storm of failed blows, Daniel was closer. Much closer. Ryan blinked in shock. How had the janitor closed the distance so easily? "Do you want to know the difference, Ryan?" Daniel asked softly, now an arm's length away. "The difference between learning in gyms and surviving in rings?" Before Ryan could speak, Daniel raised one hand and placed his palm gently against Ryan's chest. It was not a strike. It was barely more than a touch. And Ryan flew. His body lifted off the mat as if an invisible force had struck him. He landed on his back with a thud that echoed through the gym. The students gasped in unison, eyes wide in disbelief. The silence that followed was absolute. Ryan Carter lay flat on the mat, his chest heaving, eyes wide with disbelief. He had been touched, just touched, and yet the force had knocked him across the floor as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. For a long moment, no one moved. The students stood frozen, staring at Daniel Reed with expressions that ranged from awe to shock. Ryan scrambled to his elbows, his voice trembling. That's impossible." Daniel lowered his hand calmly, his breathing steady. "Not impossible. Just control, leverage, timing. The difference between someone who memorizes moves and someone who lives them." Emily's phone slipped in her hand. She had been frantically scrolling as the spar escalated, and now her voice cracked as she read aloud what she had discovered. Daniel Reed, known once as Iron Storm, 5-time world champion in mixed martial arts. Retired undefeated after an accident 20 years ago. The revelation struck like lightning. Every head in the room snapped toward Daniel. Ryan's mouth hung open. He stared at the man he had mocked, realizing the truth. He had been sparring with a living legend. Daniel gave a small nod. He wasn't smiling. "I retired at 29. I walked away and I swore never to step on a mat again. Since then, I've worked simple jobs, cleaning, fixing, living quietly. I never wanted the spotlight again." Ryan's face paled. His arrogance drained in an instant, replaced by fear and humiliation. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady. I didn't know. If I had known," Daniel's calm voice cut through. "If you had known, would you have treated me with respect? Or would you still humiliate the next man who cleans your floor? Respect doesn't depend on titles. It's in how you treat people when you think they're beneath you." The words sank into the room like heavy stones. The students shifted uneasily, realizing they had laughed along with Ryan's mockery just moments before. Emily stepped forward, her voice firm now. "Sensei Ryan, I've trained here for 2 years out of respect for your skill. But what I witnessed tonight wasn't teaching, it was bullying." Murmurs rippled through the group. Heads nodded, eyes turned cold toward Ryan. For the first time, his students saw him not as a mentor, but as a man stripped of his pride. Ryan swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "Daniel, I apologize. To you, to Emily, to everyone here. I let arrogance blind me." Daniel studied him for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes softened slightly. "Apologies are the first step. What matters is what you do next, whether you keep teaching arrogance or whether you finally learn humility." Ryan dropped his gaze. The words stung more than any blow could have, and then Emily, with a courage that surprised even herself, asked the question that no one expected. "Mr. Reed, would you consider teaching again? Not just techniques, but the respect you carry. The control, the lessons that matter more than belts." The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't tense. It was hopeful. For the first time that night, Daniel smiled. Not the polite smile of a quiet janitor, not the cold smile of Iron Storm, a genuine smile touched with warmth, maybe, but not to create champions, to teach something more important. That true strength is measured in character, not in titles. Ryan lowered his head, shame burning in his chest. His arrogance had collapsed, replaced by the bitter knowledge that he had been handed the most humiliating lesson of his life. But the question remained, would one night of humility be enough to undo years of pride? Or would Ryan need to lose more than reputation to finally change? 3 months later, the Ironwood Academy looked nothing like it had before. The echoes of that unforgettable night still lingered in every corner, but they had reshaped the place into something new. Daniel Reed was no longer just the man with the mop. Emily had spoken with the gym's owner, and after careful persuasion, they convinced him to hire Daniel not as a janitor, but as an instructor. He didn't teach beginners how to throw punches or kicks. He taught the philosophy behind martial arts, discipline, humility, and the kind of strength that outlasts bruises and belts. The students flocked to his classes. They weren't drawn by the legend of Iron Storm alone, though many whispered about it in awe. They were drawn by the way he spoke, the way he taught them that every move carried weight not just in the body, but in the heart. Ryan Carter, meanwhile, bore the scars of his humiliation. Word of the incident had spread quickly after Emily shared the recording she had discreetly captured that night. Clips of a black belt being humbled by a janitor went viral. Ryan lost half his students in the first week, many unwilling to learn under someone who had mistaken cruelty for teaching. He opened a smaller gym across town. His voice no longer boomed with arrogance. When he spoke to his students, there was hesitation, almost humility. He was no longer the untouchable sensei. He was a man who had been publicly stripped of pride, forced to look at himself through the eyes of the people he once mocked. One evening after a class, Emily lingered behind. As Daniel rolled up mats and returned gear to the shelves. "Sensei Daniel," she said softly. "Thank you. Not just for what you did that night, but for what you've done since. You've shown us that true strength doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to prove itself every moment. It simply exists and people recognize it." Daniel paused, resting his hand on the folded mat. A faint smile crossed his face. "The best lesson I can give," he said, "is never to judge anyone by their job or their appearance or their silence. Everyone carries stories. Some are heavier than we can imagine, and sometimes those stories hold storms waiting to be remembered." Emily nodded, her chest tight with gratitude. For Ryan Carter, humility had been forced upon him like a punishment. For Daniel Reed, humility had been chosen, carried like a shield. And for the students of Ironwood, the night their arrogant instructor challenged the janitor would forever stand as proof that greatness is not measured by titles or belts. Greatness is measured by character. And so Daniel Reed, once Ironstorm, found his peace not by erasing his past, but by embracing the part of him that had always mattered most. The man who had once silenced arenas now taught silence of another kind, the quiet strength of respect. Justice had been served that night, not through fists or fury, but through the revelation that arrogance always collapses before true dignity. Sometimes storms don't roar, sometimes they whisper, and sometimes their calm changes everything.